Actually, as an aside, I just want to say that Mr. Henderson's work on the Pell case, including his book, if I can put it this way, he's been doing God's work. Before this session, I was chatting to him out in the lobby, about writing books and one's desired legacy, that sort of thing. So I couldn't help asking him this question. I said, what do you want people to be saying about you in 100 years, Jared? And he gave me that penetrating stare, and he said, Jim, in 100 years, I'd like people to be saying something along the lines of, isn't it remarkable that he's still sexually active? So. I did make that up, but look, it would be remiss of me not to recount to you a brief story of our president, Stuart Wood, QC. Is it QC or SC in Victoria? I forget. QC, there we go. Stuart actually does so much work for this organization. It's unpaid work. He and Eddie put the program together. We would not be operating without those two. And so I thought I should tell you the story. Stuart was out walking, and as he's from Victoria, and so sometime in the last 3 years he was out walking. Given it's Victoria, what day he could actually legally be out walking in the 3 years is narrowed down to about, 4 days? So one of those 4 days, Stuart was out walking, and he stumbled on this little sort of old bottle, and he inadvertently rubbed it, and this genie came out. And the genie looked at Stuart, and she said, I'm a very special genie. You get 3 wishes, but for every wish you make, Stuart Wood QC, every judge and politician in Australia who's a centralist, non-federalist will get twice what you get. And so Stuart said, well, okay, I'll take $1 million for my first wish, to give the money to the Samuel Griffith Society as sort of model for the rest of you. So she blinked her eyes, Barbara Eden-like. But she said, I have to warn you, Stuart, all of those centralists, everywhere in Australia, they've now got $2 million, each one of them. What's your second wish? Stuart said, well, I'd sort of quite like I've never really had a German motor car. I'd quite like a German motor car. So you know this is a joke because nobody can think of a top barrister who doesn't already have a German motor car. Leave that aside. We'll go along with this. So she blinks her eyes and she said, Stuart, you now have a beautiful BMW top series, but every centralist in Australia, each of them has 2. So what's your third and final wish? Our canny leader pondered and thought. Finally, he turned to the genie. He said, I've always wanted to donate a kidney. Okay, so let me start. Let me start the substantive part of the talk by thanking everyone who's here attending. You are supporting Australia's only legal organization that's openly pro-federalism in any meaningful sense. We're the only one that's openly for approaches to interpreting our Constitution that that effectively do not collapse into a barely disguised legislating from the bench, usually conducted under the obfuscatory aegis or rubric of something described as a living Constitution, or if you are a big fan of Lord Sankey, then living tree, as if marks on paper were alive somehow, and then using that sort of metaphor to regularly update the Constitution. And yes, we here at the Samuel Griffith Society are the only organization that sees the record of 36 failed Section 128 constitutional referenda out of 44, not as evidence of a poor amending formula, it's so hard to amend the Australian Constitution, nothing like that, but rather evidence that the great majority of Australians, more often than not, just didn't happen to like the proposed referendum or question. They liked the written Constitution. And 2 quick points on that. I've gone back and looked at the 44 Section 128 constitutional referendum questions, and overwhelmingly I agree with the outcome. There's only 2 examples where I don't agree with the outcome. I would have voted the same way. That's point 1. So in other words, I think the voters of Australia got it right, overwhelmingly, and true, the vast preponderance of legal academics and many others, they don't take that view. But it's also true that the level of viewpoint diversity in today's Australian universities basically goes the whole gamut from A part the way to B. Don't quite get the B, but it's A part way to B. That's the level of viewpoint diversity. If Ann Toomey and I were on the same plane, it would be pretty risky. At any rate, that's a slight exaggeration. But the second point is, look, if you want constitutions that are hard to amend, right, you have to take a look at Canada and the US. So I'm Canadian, but I teach about any sort of English-speaking constitutional system with the exception of Ireland. Nobody understands Ireland. In those countries, so in Canada and the US, all constitutional change is put solely in the hands of the political class. Right? So in America, you need any proposed constitutional change basically to get 2/3 of both houses in Washington. You need 2/3 of the Senate, 2/3 of the House, and then you need 3/4 of the state legislatures. That's a hard amending procedure. And it wholly excludes people like us, regular voters. Sorry if there's any judges in the room. Right? But that's a hard procedure. But worse, take my native Canada. So post-1982, when they repatriated the Constitution, for most matters in Canada, not all, but most matters for constitutional change, you need to win a vote in both houses of Parliament. And many of you may not know the Senate in Canada is unelected. In the year 2022, it's wholly appointed, which means 99% are political placemen hacks who are getting the reward, and there's a gold medalist from the Olympics or someone who's won a Nobel Prize in science. That's the Canadian Senate. You have to get both those houses, and then you need 2/3 of the legislatures, so that's 7 out of 10, right? And there's a little subsidiary point that the 7 provinces have to represent over half the Canadian population. So that's like a little half veto for Quebec or Ontario, right? Now that's a hard procedure, but it gets even better because there are some special reserve matters in Canada, and you can't amend the Canadian Constitution on these reserve matters, and one of them is changing the Queen as head of state, right? So I'll use that as an example. So for these kind of matters, you need both houses of Parliament and every single province in Canada, right? So if do you want to know why nobody talks about a republic in Canada? It is not possible. Literally not possible. I'm just talking about what's a hard procedure. The Windsors may one day be forced out in Britain, right? Now I'm a strong sort of unemotional monarchist, but I do have to say that Charles has to shut up. He really does. The whole thing that makes our system work is having a head of state that has no opinions. He's got way too many opinions, and none of them are really sensible. But if the Windsors get tossed out one day, they'll have a home in Canada, because you know what? One of the 10 provinces in Canada is Prince Edward Island. Now, Prince Edward Island has 165,000 people. That's the population. And its main industry, now I'm jesting, but only slightly, but its main industry is Japanese tourists who come into Prince Edward Island to see where Anne of Green Gables would have lived had she been a real person. She's not a real person, but nevertheless, the book is on the Japanese curriculum. And literally, the Japanese tourists come swarming in. So Prince Edward Island, 165,000 people, has a veto on any constitutional change on the reserve special power list for 39 million people in Canada. Now that is a hard amending procedure. It's basically impossible. So when you look at the Australian amending formula, it's about one of the easiest ones. So if you know anything about comparative constitution, it's really easy. Here's what you have to do. You have to get 50% of your fellow citizens to agree with you. Ooh. Now, there is a federalism leg where you also have to get 50% of people in over half the states, and that's a genuflection in the direction of federalism. But if you look at the 36 out of 44 failed referenda, 31 of them failed because you couldn't get half the people in Australia to agree, including, I might add, the Republic referendum, which lost in every state. And of the 5 that managed to get half the Australian population to agree but failed on the federalism leg, 3 of them got this total nationally, 50.6%, 50.3%, and 50.6%. Nothing quite like 165,000 Prince Edward Islanders having a veto over 39 million people. So whenever some group of academics, because I hear it a lot, or members of the insider political class or the judicial journalist class, they're always telling you it's so hard to amend the Australian Constitution. I need to translate that for you. What they mean is, we don't like the outcome. Or we think we know better than, plumbers and secretaries who turned this down. It should have gone through and we're not happy. So we're going to say that it's really hard to amend the Australian Constitution. But it's not. And, of course, many of the insiders would prefer a Canadian or American-style system where you disenfranchise regular voters and you leave it wholly in the hands of the political class, which is what is true in most countries, and certainly Canada and the U.S. Look, if you'd left it up to the political insiders, we would be a republic already. There's just no doubt about that. And many of those other failed referenda would have gone through. So, to borrow the language of the philosophy of science, that's what I call the facts. Look, the organizers of this conference gave me a pretty wide remit. They said, just talk this afternoon about, any big case that interests you, or a couple of cases. So I'm going to do that, but I'm going to do it in what I call an Alistair Cook sort of way, sort of a letter from America. Because when I was growing up as a kid, my parents would always have on Alistair Cook's letter from one of the greatest journalists ever. You cannot listen or read one of his letters from America. He would start, and he'd meander all over the place, and he'd always end up back where he started. It was remarkable. He was 46, 50 years. I don't know how long this thing went. So I'm aiming to be half as interesting as Alistair Cook. That's a high aspirational goal. So I was tempted to talk to you today about the Peter Ridd case. But I managed to resist that temptation because basically it is more to do with the serious failings of our universities, and that could take up 5 days, and not really to do with the core business of the Samuel Griffith Society. I do think that the Peter Ridd case shows the proclivity towards empty virtue signaling of the High Court. We're going to tell you how important academic freedom is, and sorry, Peter, you lose. Bad luck. And together with a sort of, I think, total ignorance of what life on campus is like. Anyone who went to university 30 years ago hasn't got a clue. Basically hasn't got a clue what life on universities are like. And when, when the coalition wants to ask about how to fix the universities, they ask the vice chancellors. They are the problem. Occasionally they'll get a high court judge to come in and issue a report, and he'll read the codes of conduct at all the universities. But those are all enforced discretionarily. And so when, former Chief Justice French says we haven't got a free speech problem on campus, he's right, because 99% of people are progressive left, and they can say whatever they want. And you can't think of anything that would cause them to be disciplined at a university, with the possible exception of a few who are so anti-Semitic, they might be So the real problem is that the small group of people who are in any way concurrent, they will use the code of conduct against them. But I decided not to talk about that. I want to get to an important case in an indirect, sort of serpentining way. So let me transport you to my native Canada. This is the 40th anniversary of their entrenched and constitutionalized Bill of Rights called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I'm a charter refugee. I could never get a job in Canada. I can't stand the charter. But brought to you by Pierre Trudeau, but in section 1 of the charter, there's an explicit, what in the sort of jargon we call an abridging provision, a reasonable limits provision, and I'll quote it for you basically. The Charter guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. Right? So it's a blanket reasonable limits that applies to all of the then enumerated rights in the Bill of Rights. The European Convention on Human Rights, they do it right by right. They don't have a blanket one, but they do it right by right. There's a Canadian-style abridging provision in the woeful Victorian Charter of Rights, and there's also one in the New Zealand Bill of Rights. But my point here today is just that Canada now has 4 decades of experience with this sort of provision, where you ask the judges to consider what's reasonable and proportional and justifiable. So in other words, it's an invitation to weigh legislation, decide those sorts of things, whether it's proportional. And you know what? Here is a very solid empirical generalization from the Canadian case law, 4 decades. The judges there will uphold government action as being a reasonable limit on rights and on liberty when the action flows from legislation that's been enacted by political parties of the left wing. So in other words, when voters elect a left-wing government that does left-wing government-type things, that legislation is almost never invalidated by the courts. But when the judges do act, when they do decide some piece of legislation is unjustified, unreasonable, lacking proportionality, inappropriate, call it what you want, it's almost always legislation that was enacted by a right-of-center political party. So in other words, when the voters elect a right-wing government that does right-wing stuff, only then is there a realistic chance of the judicial veto kicking in. Now, lawyers, judges, legal academics, they despise anyone for putting the matter in those terms. But that's what the data shows. There's just no doubt about it. Now, given the time constraints, let's jump back to Australia. We have no National Bill of Rights. Twice the idea has been put to the voters in a Section 128 referenda. It's lost both times, most recently in 1988, lost in every state. Boy, that's a hard amending formula. It's so hard to get people to agree with us lawyers. I mean, what's going on? 4 years after that second time in 1988, the High Court discovered an implied freedom of political communication in the entrails of a 9-decade-old constitution. It was doing an amazing job hiding, I don't know, it took 90 years to find it. But, I have long argued, I'm a bit of a, I like to say what I think. I've long argued that the judges just made it up out of thin air. And I'm not very polite. And I consider myself the most pro-free speech academic in Australia. I like the outcome. But there's a difference between outcomes you like and honest interpretation. This is not honest interpretation. It's patently, I think, interpretation in the service of agenda. That was the ACTV case. Now, I've written all sorts of things. I'm tired of it. Law reviews, books, everything, where I just run through why I think the reasoning in that case, and you can pick your favorite adjective, labored, strained, unconvincing, if you want a big word, Jesuitical, sophistical, reasoning in the service of an agenda. You can just call it what you want. But the fact is that it stuck. And so there's now a body of case law that asks judges, in effect, to decide as regards to some challenged piece of legislation, whether the purpose of the law is legitimate, whether it's reasonably appropriate, adapted to advance a legitimate object, whether it places a burden on the freedom, whether you can justify that, whether there are other less restrictive measures, whether the law is necessary, and on and on and on it goes into the horizon. All these are subjective call, piled on subjective call. They're just different ways in which you ask the judges to ask if the judges think the statute being challenged is proportional, justified, reasonable in the circumstances. Now remember, those kind of questions inevitably raise debatable issues over which smart, reasonable, well-intentioned people disagree. Always. Heck, if you look at most of the cases in Canada and Australia, the judges are disagreeing amongst themselves. You get 5-4 decisions all over the place in Canada and 4-3 here. So that suggests that, on the way to deliver the judgment, if one of the judges had changed his mind, what was proportional, reasonable, and justified would have flipped over, amazingly, on the way to the courthouse. So, there's a real problem. And the point I want to make today is this, and it's one that's virtually never made in polite legal company in this country. I feel like I'm like Penn and Teller about to reveal a sort of magical secret. I'm going to get thrown out of the magic circle. It's a safe space. Okay, here's the thing that you never hear in Australia, and judges hate it when you say it. So this relates back to what I just said about Canada. So this is an empirical point. And I understand why barristers can't say anything, because they make their living in front of these judges. But since that 1986 ACTV case, which was labor legislation, every single other piece of legislation that has ever been invalidated in this country under the implied freedom banner, so over 30 years, has been coalition government legislation. I don't know how many people knew that in the room. I did. So that's one of those facts you're not supposed to raise, because, it might suggest things like, for instance, that the worldviews and outlooks of those from the lawyerly caste, from which top judges are then chosen, noticeably differ from the views of the voters. That the median lawyers and judges' views look nothing like the median voters. And in the U.S., where political donations are public information, there is so much data that shows precisely that. That lawyers, and if you go back 50 years, the median lawyer's view was to the right of the median voters. People think lawyers were sort of conservative. One of the papers today pointed to, a conservative activist case. He had to point back to 1905. In the Lochner case, I said, well, yes, in 1905, lawyers probably were conservative. But they're not today. The data's pretty clear. The median outlook political outlook of the lawyerly caste is not just a little to the left of the median voter, it's really to the left of the median voter. And if you want to find some of the wokest places going, just wander downtown and go into one of the big law firms. So, go back now to the Brown case, or Roach, or Roe, or the two unions in New South Wales. 5 times the implied freedom has been invoked. That the one that was mystically discovered hiding somewhere, maybe it was hanging out between section 57 and 58, kept moving around, who knows. But it was mystically discovered, and it empowers the judges to invalidate legislation. And again, each and every time that it's invoked and actually used, it's been coalition legislation. So if I can put that a different way, we see here what we saw in Canada. You get this huge, and I think it's incredibly sophistical, but you get this huge edifice of proportionality reasoning. So you read Kiefel, and then you read Gagler, and it's like you're reading some medieval philosophical text, right? I did a doctorate in moral philosophy. I'm pretty good at logic. It's talk about pins, angels on the heads of pins. So you bring this reasoning to bear to decide if some piece of legislation can withstand the implied freedom analysis. And each and every time the answer is no, it can't withstand it, it's coalition legislation. Now, I don't know if there's any gamblers in the room. Lots of lawyers are innumerate. If you go outside in the hall with a coin and you flip it 5 times, the odds of them all coming up heads or all coming up tails is 1 in 32. There's way more cases in Canada. The odds of getting their sort of outcomes are basically vanishing slight. Now, of course, there's lots and lots and lots of other times when you have to bring this analysis to bear to look at cases, and those cases are labor legislation and liberal legislation, and in those cases, they get a big tick, the legislation. So there's an incredible expense involved. Now, the expense goes to lawyers, so I don't want to be too critical in a room like this, right? This is a nice line of work. But ultimately, you might observe is not only that this is highly remunerative work. God, I feel like Joe Biden, remunerative. I'll shake hands with nothing and get back to the job here. And don't send up an Easter bunny to shepherd me away, okay, if you don't mind. Look, whether a cost-benefit analysis shows that this sort of massive edifice that has to be trotted out and it costs litigants a huge amount of money for 5 times invalidating legislation is worth it, I don't think so. But my point today is different. Let me tell you what a leading British legal academic, so no conservative like me, what he says about proportionality analysis, the kind that our High Court trots out all the time. This is Professor Thomas Poole at the LSE. I'm going to quote, "Proportionality is plastic and can in principle be applied almost infinitely forcefully or infinitely cautiously, producing an area of discretionary judgment that can be massively broad or incredibly narrow or anything else in between." Gregoire Weber in Canada goes through them all. He just says, these are highly discretionary calls. If you were less kind, less discreet, and less circumspect, sort of like me, you might come close to saying this amounts to legislating from the bench. Now in Canada, the judges were given this job by the politicians. It was the political class under Pierre Trudeau that entrenched the Charter of Rights, with its explicit abridging provision. In Australia, the judges were given this job by themselves. Or that's the way I read it. So on any sort of careful analysis of the reasoning in the ACTV case and exceptions. Now, in both countries, you see the same trend. The legislation that's in reality under threat is right-of-center legislation. Now, that could be chance, right? It could be chance. It doesn't look like it, but it could be. Or it could be something else. It could be related to the lack of viewpoint diversity in law schools. And this is a huge problem. The libs are going to fix it by, phoning a few vice chancellors. Beats me. No one ever asked me, or William Coleman put out a whole book on how to fix the universities. Nobody called him. He was speaking this morning. But it could be due to the lack of viewpoint diversity in law schools over the last 4 decades, or it could be related to how social justice, human rights frameworks in law schools have just colonized everything. You can't get I feel sorry for the sort of black-letter contract lawyer desperately trying to figure out how to teach contract law through the prism of human rights framework, because otherwise, they're not going to get promoted. Or it could just be having to do with how the rights-related framework of seeing the world is essentially one that's more friendly to left-of-center causes. If you're a big-spending government and you're pro-affirmative action, and there's almost no one you wouldn't let into the country, it's hard to see how a rights-related framework is ever going to impinge on your legislation. Now, I'm not talking about this current Liberal government when I gave those criteria. I'm actually talking about sort of Labour governments. But, that was a joke. You shouldn't have to tell people it's your joke. I do that with my wife. She looks at me. It's sort of weird. So at any rate, I'm just here pointing out the empirical reality. But it leads to this unfortunate corollary, right? Judicial appointments matter. And they matter a lot. And if it's going to be about one's sense of what's reasonable or what's justifiable, then I think it's a Jane Austen-like truth, universally acknowledged but always under the breath, that the person doing the assessing of these things always thinks that his or her own views are reasonable. If you ask people what's reasonable, they might create a reasonable person test, but what they really mean is, here's what I think is reasonable. It's almost impossible not to think that, right? And so there's really no neutral, non-subjective way to make these sort of assessments, because the honest truth is, when you're talking about a reasonable course of action, there's always a spectrum. Right? There's a spectrum of reasonable choices, and picking them is just arbitrary. If you pick one of the myriad reasonable options, it's arbitrary. And so there's no sort of non-subjective way to make the call. And that's why I have spent a big chunk of my sort of academic career arguing against bills of rights and for keeping these sort of legislative calls where they belong, and they belong in the hands of the democratically elected legislators, because those are the people who are regularly accountable to the voters for the calls they make. Judges, philosopher king judges making these sort of calls are accountable to their own consciences, and that's not enough for me. You can talk about all these grand theories and principles, but at the end of the day, they're enforced by real-life people. People disagree, they have different moral views, and there's no accountability mechanism. But since our top judges have given themselves this task, then we non-judges have to take it very seriously. And we have to take seriously who we put on the top courts. I don't like that fact. I'd like to go back 50 years when we didn't have to worry about this sort of stuff, and a Labour Prime Minister could appoint a Conservative, or a Conservative Prime Minister could appoint a Labour. Well, you can't do that today. So I think those of us on the right of center side of the political spectrum, we do a terrible job at appointing judges. No offense to anyone in the room. But I speak in general terms, so probably not people who come to this conference, right? And this isn't a problem just in Australia. It's a problem in Canada. It's a problem everywhere in the Anglosphere. To be fair, the American Republican Party seems to have finally sort of sorted it out. But they're the only ones, and it's not easy, and you get massively pilloried, and they have a pretty unique system. You have to put it up for public confirmation hearings. But if you want evidence of a less than great job on appointments, so there's lots in my view, but my number one exhibit has to be the 2 year ago Love case, right? So I gave a Zoom talk for this session. I don't know if anybody even watches Zoom. It was during COVID, but I did a Samuel Griffith Zoom talk. And look, if you are unfortunate enough to have someone point a gun at your head and make you read the Love case, you will see that the Love case was decided on such, long-standing constitutional concepts as, and I'm not making any of this up, otherness, deeper truths, these are all quotes, intuitions about Aboriginal people's essentially spiritual connections with country. And that, you need to put country in scare quotes, I don't know why. So you remember, always put country in scare quotes if you want to be at the cutting edge. And the list goes on. Now, this was a 4-3 decision. And in the majority were the 3 most recent appointments. All George Brandis appointees. This is an astounding indictment of the appointments process. So you let that sink in. All of those quotes I read out were from coalition appointees within the last, 7 years or whatever. Now, I think in this room we may not all be able to get together and agree or easily articulate exactly what characteristics we want from our top judicial appointees, but I think everyone in this room is likely to agree what we emphatically do not want. And we don't want judges who indulge in postmodernist, New Age mysticism, sort of basically idiotic claptrap. Otherness. What, did they make a mistake and turn into the French deconstructionist, seminar? I don't know. So in my view, the Love decision was even worse than the Roe decision. And Ann Toomey picked that as the worst case, but I think she picked that as the worst case because that was, when she made that pick, Love hadn't been decided. So here's the thing. At present, there's a case before the High Court. I think they've heard the argument. They haven't decided. It's called the Montgomery case. It's a challenge to the Love case, right? And, more than a few commentators on the political left are voicing concerns that, there might be some pending political activism on the High Court were Love to be overturned. That's pretty laughable because in my, over a quarter century of being a law professor, I can't remember any time when left-leaning constitutional law academics or journalists ever worried about judicial activism when it delivered a result they liked. Never, not once. But with the prospect of maybe overriding Love, and anyway, more interestingly, what's in play in Montgomery is not people calling for new judicial activism to override old judicial activism. What's in play is a pretty big-ticket item in legal philosophy. It's, there's a big literature, and it's a very interesting question. It's the deep and long-standing issue. When a judge believes that a past constitutional case was wrongly decided, is his or her loyalty or feasance to stare decisis and to the views of earlier judges who made that wrong call, or ought it to be to the Constitution itself? Now, I happen to believe, there are different factors at work if you're talking constitutional, statutory, or common law, but we'll just focus on constitutional law. So think of the issue this way. You're the judge. Is your fealty at the point of application to those who were deemed to have the legitimate authority to create the foundational legal text? Or is your loyalty to those who have already issued an authoritative ruling as to the meaning of some provision that's being litigated? One party is asking for an explicit override, and you think the earlier judgment was wrong. Now, I believe the correct answer is your loyalty is to the Constitution. There's lots of writing on this. I think the most persuasive writing is you as the judge owe your loyalty to the Constitution and to the citizens who have to live under it, right? But the other option is that your loyalty is to the past judgment, the past court, to your former colleagues who issued a ruling that you don't agree with. Now, of course, there can sometimes be reliance interests that kick in as regards some wrongly decided past case, and they can raise the costs of overturning that to an extent that occasionally might be close to catastrophic, and that kind of consideration might prevail. But we're certainly not talking about that if Montgomery were to override or overrule Love. So we'll all have to wait to see what happens. But let me finish then, and let me just say this, remembering that 2 of the judges since Love have since retired, and we've had 2 replacements. And I say this with a deep sense of relief. The 2 replacements were not by Mr. Brandis, so we can take a sigh. But rather than say anything else about Montgomery, let me finish with this. It's an analogy. You can see how it bears yourself. Think back to 1975 and the High Court decision. It's known as the First Territory Senator's case. It was on the issue of whether Territorians could be given representation by Parliament. And it involved a very unique sort of instance in constitutional cases where there are 2 provisions that look like they're mutually inconsistent. So here's Section 7 of our Constitution. The Senate shall be composed of senators for each state, directly chosen by the people of the state, voting until the Parliament otherwise provides as one electorate. And here's Section 122. That provides for the Commonwealth to make laws for any territory, including representation. And this provision provides Parliament may make laws for the government of any territory surrendered by any state to and accepted by the Commonwealth. This isn't the important part. Or any territory placed by the Queen under the authority of and accepted by the Commonwealth or otherwise acquired by the Commonwealth. And here's the important part. And Parliament may allow the representation of such territory in either house of the Parliament to the extent and on the terms which it thinks fit. Pretty hard to read 7 and 122 together. So this is a pretty tough interpretive call. And the High Court in 1975 decided 4-3 that Section 122, yes, Parliament can provide representation to the territories, trumped Section 7. If you want evidence that our Constitution is the most American Constitution in the world, which it is, maybe the Philippines, but probably us, it's not only that we have an American upper house, we have American federalism, and we have a capital city that sits outside any of the states, all copied. If you're in Washington, D.C., you don't get to vote for the Senate or the House. You get to vote for someone in the House who gets to watch, but they don't get to do anything. They can only vote for president. And so that was in play in 1975. And the High Court comes along and decides 4-3 that 122 trumps 7. Now, I confess I think the High Court got that right. It's hard for me to say that because that puts me in the camp of Mason and Murphy. sort of biting, and not in the camp of Gibbs and Stevens. So it's not my usual home, if I can be as polite as possible. 2 years later, the case is relitigated because one of the 4 majority justices, McTiernan, retired, and new government comes in, Fraser government, replaces that justice with Justice Aiken. And in the rehearing, and it's a very imaginative name for this case, but this is the second Territory Senator's case, Chief Justice Barwick, he sticks with his original dissenting view. The new Judge Aiken agrees with Barwick and the dissenters, but Gibbs and Stevens flip. They join Murphy, Mason, and Jacobs. And Gibbs and Stevens say they still think they were right the first time, but they valued stare decisis more than their view of what the Constitution actually meant. So they implicitly opted to put the reputation of the court, and maybe even their desire to see that the High Court is not seen as overly politicized, they put that above what they believe the Constitution actually meant. Now, in my view, there's no other way to put this. Gibbs and Stevens were badly wrong to do that. They got it seriously wrong, in my view. A judge's highest loyalty ought to be to the Constitution itself and to all of us non-judges who have to live under it, as the product of those who had the legitimate authority to make it. Now, I say that even though on balance I think the High Court got it right in the first case, and I say that even though I'm massively more of a Gibbs and Barwick man than a Mason and Murphy man. That's about the politest way I can put it. And I say that even though Sir Harry Gibbs was the founding president of this great Samuel Griffith organization. You see, having scope to be iconoclastic is another great thing about the Samuel Griffith organization, which I hope brings us full circle, Alistair Cook-like, back to the beginning. So I finish by noting that I really hope that we don't see any of the judges who are in the minority in love opting to copy the sort of Stephen Gibbs in Montgomery and selling out their view of the true meaning of the Constitution. So thank you.